Thank you, Madam President. I concur in the remarks that Senator Durbin just made, especially about the vote last night. The primary thing we did was we spared that $2,000 tax increase for so many families in California and Illinois and Ohio and across this country. I remember the presiding officer telling a group of us last night how many hundreds of thousands of Californians would have lost their unemployment insurance if we had not acted last night the way that we did. My fundamental criteria on voting on this issue and voting for this issue was we were able successfully to stop cuts in Social Security to pay for some of this plan, or raising the retirement age for Medicare, or not doing the unemployment insurance in the way that we did. So all of those were victories last night. I also concur with Senator Durbin that while adding 5 years to the Earned Income Tax Credit, locking in one of the best poverty fighting programs begun by Ronald Reagan, suggested, I believe, by Milton Friedman, supported by both parties for many years. We're not seeing that the way that we used to with the Earned Income Tax Credit. It rewards families that work. A family making $30,000 a year, not a whole lot more than the minimum wage, $3, $4 more maybe than the minimum wage, but not a livable wage, that they get significant tax credits, a sort of what Friedman called a negative income tax. And this works so well for encouraging work in this country. We did that only for 5 years, while the estate tax, bringing it up to $5 million exemption, which I thought was far too generous, because it's only paid by far fewer than 1% of the American people. That was made permanent, while the Earned Income Tax Credit was only made for 5 years. The tax credit for college students, for families, was so important in this legislation too. And much of what we did was simply ask the wealthy to pay a little bit more, to bring tax rates, as the presiding officer knows, back to the levels of the 1990s. And I think it's important to put it in a little historical perspective. In the 1990s, tax rates were a little bit higher for upper income people. We saw in those 8 years in the 1990s, from 93 to 2000, the presiding officer's first year in the Senate, in 1993, my first year in the House, we saw incredible economic growth. Wages went up. For the average American, average Ohio, and average California, average American. We saw 21 million private sector net jobs created, and President Clinton left office with the largest budget surplus in American history. We know what happened the next 8 years, where we saw very little economic growth, only about 1 million, being generous, only about 1 million private sector net jobs created in those 8 years. And we saw, which hit my state particularly hard, we saw a real decline in manufacturing. From 2000 to 2010, we lost in this country net 5 million manufacturing jobs. And manufacturing jobs, maybe people that dress like this around here don't think much about that. I know the presiding officer does, because her state's the #1 manufacturing state in the country. It's especially important in my state. We lost hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. And while we lost 5 million manufacturing jobs nationally, tens of thousands, I believe 60,000 is the number of manufacturing plants closed in those 10 years. But the good news is, since the auto rescue, we have seen beginning to be significant manufacturing job growth, some 500,000 new manufacturing jobs since 2010. Almost every month, not quite every month, but almost every month, increase in manufacturing jobs. And we know what a manufacturing job does in a community. If a worker's making $20 or $25 an hour, that worker's spending money in that community. That worker is buying things, buying a home, buying a car, putting people to work, creating jobs at restaurants, creating jobs at the hardware store, paying property tax to hire teachers, paying the local city income tax to hire firefighters and police. So we know what manufacturing jobs do as we see that increase. In fact, since the auto rescue, in my state, the unemployment rate went from 10.6% soon after the auto rescue sort of took effect, if you will, and now the unemployment rate is under 7%. It's not what it ought to be, but I think that's what last night's vote ultimately, Madam President, was a recognition of that people here with this 89 to 8 vote, 89 votes yes, 8 votes no, strong bipartisan support, which I hope we see this afternoon in the House. I think it was a recognition that you don't grow the economy by tax cuts for the rich and trickle-down economics. We tried that in the last decade. It didn't work. We understand, historical evidence shows it. I think we recognized it last night. By focusing on the middle class, tax cuts for the middle class, investments in schools and investments in infrastructure and unemployment insurance for people that have lost their jobs, keeping Social Security and Medicare strong, investing in college credits and rewarding work through the earned income tax credit, we grow the economy from the middle class out. And that succeeded in the 1990s, 20 million plus new manufacturing jobs. Trickle down didn't do so well the 10 years after. Now we're coming back and recognizing with this overwhelmingly vote last night, both parties are recognizing that you grow the economy from the middle class out. I think that's why last night was a huge victory, surely politically for the president, but what it was a victory for, really, Madam President, was a victory for the middle class and a victory for those who want to join, aspire to the middle class, and a victory for this country, for our economy, for our economic growth, for our future. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.